Hello ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to view this short screen tutorial on the Vietnam War and why there was growing opposition to it in the United States of America from historychappy.com. I think there are 5 main reasons why opposition grew. You may agree, you may disagree, but these are my 5 in no particular order. The first one was that it didn't appear to American citizens or soldiers that they were winning, or at least that they were winning quickly or cheaply enough. Now, in any democracy, when casualty rates rise in war, you'll usually find opposition to that war will grow in line with it to some degree. This was the case in the Vietnam War with the Americans. The US were hoping that their advantages in modern technology and weaponry would be able to win them through. But this wasn't the case in Vietnam, because the Viet Cong fought a guerrilla war, often in dense jungle on home soil which they knew well, which eroded and blunted the advantage the US had in those areas. The Viet Cong set booby traps, they used extensive tunnel networks, they often didn't wear uniforms so the US soldiers couldn't differentiate between civilian and soldier, and they usually melted away silently like ghosts back into the jungle after attacks, which was hugely frustrating for American soldiers and made them feel like they actually weren't winning because they couldn't pinpoint the enemy to retaliate or to launch attacks. So even though the communists experienced higher losses in the Vietnam War, the US public became less committed to the war as time went on, and their uncles, brothers and cousins were coming home maimed from the war, psychologically disturbed, or, worst case scenario, not at all. So the US public resolve dropped as the Viet Cong resolve rose. So the US became less committed to the war, which they didn't think they were winning, or at least winning quickly or cheaply enough. So that's my first reason. Second, the use of chemical weapons such as napalm and Agent Orange, which were weapons that were used on large areas of jungle. Napalm to burn anything in its way. The idea was that the napalm would scorch anything in a particular area. Now, it would be able to hurt those Viet Cong forces, but it also hurt any civilians, including women, children, the old, the sick, and anything in its way. It essentially burned their skin off. Really, really brutal. Agent Orange was like a pesticide. The idea with that is it would get rid of all the jungle where the Viet Cong were hiding, so the Americans could accurately pinpoint the enemy. It also caused mass human suffering, as you can see. So napalm and Agent Orange, the uses of those horrified Americans back home because the media was able to report it in America and beam these images into people's homes or via magazines and newspapers. So chemical warfare began to turn many people against the war in Vietnam. My third reason is the student draft. Now, students were called up to fight in Vietnam. This was called drafting them into the armed forces. As the war became unpopular, so did the draft. Now, any group of people that are forced to fight in the war, you'll often find, no surprises, that the war is quite unpopular with them. Because students were drafted en masse, the war became unpopular with them, and there were mass student protests against the war. Some students burnt their draft cards in a public act of protest, and organised protests and marches. This was called draft dodging. One person that was accused of draft dodging, even though he wasn't a student, was Muhammad Ali, and it was a highly popularised or a highly public court case where he refused to go and fight. Now, as the death toll rose, students taunted the president, Lyndon B. Johnson, with a chant, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" Brutal and horrible and highly effective at removing any smidgen of popularity he had remaining. The National Guard were often used to subdue those protests on university campuses, which caused further friction between the government and students. One such example would be the Kent State University shooting in 1970, when 4 students were shot by the National Guard. So student draft and draft dodging, one reason why it became unpopular. Another one was the My Lai massacre. This was where a group of US soldiers killed between 300 and 400 civilians in a place called My Lai, which was the location of a Viet Cong headquarters in 1968. However, most of the people killed were not Viet Cong fighters. They were women, children and elderly people by machine gun fire in a ditch, which did not go down well. in America. The magazine Life published pictures of the massacre, as horrifying as they were, and in November 1969, 700,000 anti-war protesters demonstrated against the war in Washington, D.C. Now, if you compare that to the amount of people that attended the March on Washington with Martin Luther King, you're talking more than double that. So huge amounts of people turning out to protest against the war by 1969. The public reaction was largely due to the fact that the media could feed these horrific images back to the people at home, something that wasn't possible to the same extent in previous conflicts when the technology wasn't available. The Vietnam War, here's a quote for you, was a media war. So journalists were on the front line, and that links to the next one, whereby the media played an active role on the front line of the Vietnam War, instantly beaming those images into people's living rooms. Now, in the 1950s, there were only about 9% of American homes with a TV, but by the mid-60s, almost all American homes, by 66, 93% of people in America had a TV. And video cameras were used widely by journalists on the front line. As a consequence, the government faced a big challenge in censoring all this new media for the first time. A bit like the issues that governments have today with internet sites, which they haven't been used to, and they've got to police and regulate those in new ways. It was the same back then with TV. With limited government controls over the media could publish those really, really uncensored pictures, those brutal pictures and videos showing the horrors of the war in Vietnam, the horrors for Vietnamese citizens, but also the horrors for American troops serving. Now, as casualties rose, the media reporting of the war obviously became more negative. This had an impact on how the American public perceived the war, and it just generally became more and more unpopular. No longer with the TV could military failure, casualties and the horrors of war be covered up. It was beamed directly and instantly into people's homes in a way that had not been possible before. In World War II, yes, there were journalists reporting back, but this was often delayed and was often in sort of bite-sized format. Didn't have the instant impact of that the reporting in Vietnam did when people have TVs. So the media is another reason. Here are my 5. Now, again, in no particular order. I'll run through them again quickly with you. Failure to win quickly or cheaply enough, or to make their advantages count for the Americans. Number 2, the use of chemical weapons, angered and repulsed many Americans. Number 3, the draft made the war highly unpopular with students. There's no surprises there. 4, if you want one particular event that stood out for Americans as being an atrocity, the My Lai massacre. And interlinked with that is the media, and the fact that the media could beam these horrible, gruesome images of war directly into American citizens' homes. They're my 5. Whether you agree or not, I don't know, but that's what I think. I hope that's been useful for you. For this tutorial and many others, please visit www.historychappy.com.